I speak to you in the name of one God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. Please be seated. Well, most of you have heard us share about this, but I wanted to bring up that this past summer, a group of youth and adults went to Uniontown, Pennsylvania, and we did mission work, right? It was part of work camp, and during the day, we would go out and we would serve. We would serve the people in Uniontown, and we did what was asked of us. So my particular group went to a home that it had been a temporary home, and they'd sort of tried to make it permanent. So this house had 2 porches and a lot of siding, and trim. And the owner asked us to paint it all red. So we had a big job ahead of us, and it was all exterior painting. And when we got in it, we dove right in, and we painted, and we realized that the color he had given us was not red. It was actually pink. But we checked, and this is what we were told to do. This is the color. You got to use this color. Okay. So we kept painting the house pink, right? And in the end, it was fine. But we also were painting over wood that was rotting, painting over boards that had sort of come up and where nails were protruding. And we really wanted it to be perfect. We wanted to replace all the wood that was rotting and make sure everything was pristine. And we wanted to make sure that where the paint was coming off and we couldn't really paint it, even though we tried sanding and everything else. We wanted to make sure that that was all new and shiny for him. But that's not what he asked us to do. What he asked us to do was to paint and to do the best we could. And when we were finished, he was so overjoyed, and he had written us a note, and his family was incredibly grateful. So when we came in, we had this idea of what it meant to serve, of what that looked like, of how we wanted it to be. But he had another request. So for some of us, it was a little bit challenging during the week, but we followed that. And the house was pink, and the wood was not perfect. But we did serve. Now, in our gospel passage today, Jesus talks about service. And you have to wonder where James and John have been for the last few passages. Because Jesus has just finished talking all about the first will be last. Not head of the line, not the most important ones. The first will be last. And then after that, Jesus goes into detail about how he will be delivered over to the chief priest. He will be mocked and spit on, and he will die. And then you have James and John who saunter up and say, hey, we want to be on your right and left. Can we do that? So Jesus naturally asks, what exactly are you asking for here? And in one of the other Gospels, the writer changes this a little bit and makes it so that the mother is the one who's asking the question. The mother comes forward and says, could you please, please, please make sure that my sons have a really important place in heaven, on the right and the left? So whether it's the mother or whether it's actually these 2 disciples, I don't think matters much, but they have had the audacity to ask this question. Now, the other disciples respond, and they are very upset with them. We don't know if they're embarrassed or if they're jealous, right? Maybe they had the same idea, but they weren't about to ask. But at the end, Jesus talks again about how the first will be last, but this time he uses the metaphor of service. And he says, whoever would be great among you must be your servant, And whoever would be first, you must be a slave of all. For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. Now, for those of you in the Wednesday morning Bible study, you know that we have discussed this passage, and I had you read Archbishop William Temple. And in the 1930s, William Temple referenced this passage as he was talking about prayer. And Temple says that when we ask something in prayer, that this is what Christ asks of us. So when we ask, Christ returns with a question and says, "Can you share my sacrifice?" So Jesus says to us, "Can you share my sacrifice?" Now Temple continues, if your prayer is selfish, the answer will be something that will rebuke your selfishness. So all prayer becomes that offering of ourselves in union with the sacrifice of Christ, which finds its perfect expression in the Eucharist. Now that's a pretty deep question. Can you share my sacrifice? Because it assumes first that we acknowledge that there is a sacrifice, that Christ did in fact die for us, and that it is not all fame and glory like these brothers seem to assume. And that sometimes serving others looks nothing like you expect it to. When we went to Uniontown, we had a certain idea of what it would look like. Some of those expectations were fulfilled, and others were shifted and changed. But the point in service is that it is this act of humbling ourselves, of saying that we are not the most important person or thing. There are other hurts and needs in the world. And it is in that process that we draw closer to God and that we become like Christ. Because Jesus is asking us here to be a true servant leader. Now, if you've been around the church long enough, you may have heard that phrase. And I think this passage exemplifies it. A servant leader, meaning leading by example, and your example is one of service. So you humble yourselves. Just when we bow at the altar, we humble ourselves before God. We humble ourselves so that we may draw closer to Jesus. So as we head into our week, I invite you to think about this question. James and John had a very quick answer to Jesus. But I encourage you to think on it a little bit more and pray about what it means when Jesus asks us the question, "Can you share my sacrifice?" Amen.